This is lecture 16 and unit 3. We're talking now about the prophets, still continuing to talk about the prophets, and in particular now it's on to Muhammad. The birth of Muhammad is, I should say that we really don't know a whole lot about him from the Quran, and that's why the traditions are important to Muslims, because you really don't know much from the Quran about him. So the traditions, in other words, what Muhammad said and did, allegedly, supplements the Quran. But he was born, as previously mentioned, he was born in about 570, and he belonged to the Quraysh tribe, which was one of the tribes there. And his uncle, a fellow by the name of Abu Talib, is really the one who stuck with him. In other words, he was turned against people. They rejected him, and probably they could have destroyed him, but for his uncle, Abu Talib. Talib means student, and Abu, of course, is father. There is, people use this word today, for instance, the Taliban in Pakistan and Afghanistan. That's where the word comes from, students. And you'll find the word used in other parts of the Muslim world as well for various movements, often for, I think, extremist movements. But Abu Talib is an interesting guy. He protected his son, or protected his nephew, as you might expect. Arabs stick together, but Abu Talib never became a Muslim. He just said that when Muhammad pressed him later on, he said, "No, I'm too old," and he never became a Muslim. So Abu Talib is not the hero he could have been in Islamic history had he become a Muslim. And the story goes on that when Abu Talib was on his deathbed, Muhammad urged him again to become a Muslim, but he was just silent. He never said anything. So he died outside of Islam. Muslims will try to, I guess, sort of like Christians, to get you to declare your faith just before you die. In other words, one of my friends died in Pakistan, I can remember, and after I left, and the story went that the Muslim neighbors gathered around and tried to get him to say the Shahada, tried to get him to say that he was a Muslim. He was a Christian, but it's quite surprising that they would feel this, I guess, strongly. I know Christians do, of course, and we think that if a person, even on his deathbed, will confess Jesus Christ as Lord and Savior, that the person can be saved. Muhammad tried the same with Abu Talib, and it didn't work. But Muslims today would try to get a confession from somebody, thinking that even it was a confession of the 11th hour, it'll work. And it's better to die a Muslim than a non-Muslim. But having said that, Muslims do not have an assurance of salvation at all. None of them can say that when I die, I'll be with God. In other words, I will go to heaven. This was a great testimony in my life when I was in Pakistan in 1972, when my dad was killed in a car accident in Canada. I was very comforted by Psalm 23, and I was able to tell he lived on a couple of days, and then he passed away. And I was able to tell my Muslim friends that my dad was in heaven, and they were pretty shocked by that. But that's what we believe. We know that he that has eternal life is the one who has believed in the Son, and so absent from the body and present with the Lord. And that's what I believe. That's what the Bible says. And so I did give that testimony of assurance. There is no assurance of salvation in Islam, only the hope that someone who dies in a battle for the Lord, they call it a shaheed, a martyr, will go to heaven. But even then, let's be careful, because some of the things that drives Muslims to martyrdom, as for instance, the Palestinian martyrdoms, even if it's a 16-year-old girl, it's more than that hope. It's a terrible hopelessness on this earth, and trauma, and all of the things that contribute to the depression and the despair that surrounds many Muslims. The last point here is that Muhammad was an orphan, and as we already suggested, in fact, he was, because he was taken care of by his uncle in 93, 6 through 7. And by the way, these chapters at the end of the Quran, maybe I've mentioned this before, but these are the revelations that came first. And the Quran is set up that way so that the revelations at the back, were the shortest, are the ones that actually came first, because the Quran was put together in that way, the longest ones at the beginning and the shortest ones at the end. So when we read Surah 93 and these verses, this is what Muhammad experienced in his early life. It says, did he not find thee an orphan, and give thee shelter and care? And he found thee wandering, and he gave thee guidance. That verse indicates that Muhammad wasn't perfect. In other words, that word wandering could mean morally, or certainly wasn't perfect. Didn't he find thee wandering, and give thee sustenance? And he found thee in need, and made thee independent. So Muhammad was poor in the beginning, but then later, as when he married Khadija, who was wealthy. In fact, she proposed to him when he was 25 and she was 40. She had been married a couple of times before, but their husband had died. And now, through Khadija, he became quite wealthy. He inherited her wealth, of course, because eventually she died, but he lived on. And then the next verse says, therefore treat not the orphans with harshness. So Muhammad has a tender spot in his heart for orphans. And as we might have mentioned before, he did put a stop to the female infanticide, burying of unwanted baby girls, which was one of the terrible practices in pre-Islam. So there were some things about Muhammad that are certainly worthwhile. So those are just a few things about Muhammad, his birth, the Quraysh tribe, Abu Talib, and the fact that he was an orphan. These charts here show his family tree. As we noted, he was from the Quraysh tribe, the family of Hashim, and his grandfather was Abdul Muttalib. Abdul meaning servant of Allah, Abdul Muttalib. And as we just talked about, his uncle was Abu Talib. His father was Abdullah, servant of Allah. And his father married Amina from, I believe it was Medina. So Amina died apparently shortly after Muhammad was born, and his father too died. So he is raised basically by Abu Talib, his uncle. And as I mentioned before, he was protected by him. Muhammad here, there are 3 of his wives mentioned. Khadija was the first one, as we've already said that Khadija proposed to him. In other words, she was a businesswoman. This tells you a little bit too about pre-Islam. All of the women were not put down, or at least they were, we sometimes think that, well, Muhammad lifted them up. But here's an example of Khadija, who was a businesswoman. She had wealth and she had means, and she ran a business, and she had hired Muhammad to be to work for her, and he was called Al-Amin, the faithful one. So he must have been faithful, trustworthy, and he was sent on expeditions. Then shortly, either after, I believe, as soon as she died, he married a couple of more. One was Hafsa, and Hafsa basically was married to care for his children. And then he married another girl. He was given Aisha. He married Aisha when she was very, very young. And the tradition says that they had sexual intercourse when she was 9. Probably she was given to him before that time. So that's a blot on the prophet's character. But it is not surprising in the culture. In other words, certainly not the right thing to do. But Aisha was definitely his favorite. And when you look at all his wives, I think about 16 or whatever, how many wives he had, it's hard to say, including a couple of concubines. Aisha is the favorite, and they seem to love one another. Abu Bakr was the first caliph. In other words, after Muhammad died, his father-in-law, Abu Bakr, took over. So that's a little bit on the side. Aisha was a pretty sparky gal, and she stood up for herself every once in a while. You find in the traditions interesting stories of some of the things she said and did when she didn't agree with him. She had a certain amount of spark. Maybe that's why he liked her. And the tradition says that when Muhammad died in 632, he died in the arms of Aisha. Muhammad was supposed to treat all of his wives equally. In other words, he had sort of made this commitment that he'd spend so much time with one and then with the other, and so equally divided. But he had a favorite, had some favorites, and Aisha was one of them, the most favorite. And others too, who were younger and more attractive, were somewhat favored as well. Here are listed some of his daughters. Interestingly, Muhammad never had a son, which is a disgrace in Arab culture. One of the daughters that is most famous is Fatima, who married Ali, you see, and then from there came two sons, Hassan and Hussein. I believe they were twins. And Hussein was the one who was so brutally murdered in 680 at the Battle of Karbala. We know now from the troops being over there and one thing and another, we hear of these places in Iraq. That's where Hussein was so brutally murdered in 680, and that's the martyrdom of Ali, well, actually of Hussein, who is the son of Ali, that is mourned from year to year to year to year during the first month of the year. And that's a story in itself. But that was the famous one, Fatima, who married Ali, and then they had the two sons. Other daughters, Ruqya and Kulthum and Zainab, which is a very popular name. But Ruqya married Uthman, who was the third caliph. And I think this is a mistake here, but it doesn't matter. It just shows some of the daughters and so on. And down here you have the chronological picture of the caliphs. Abu Bakr, as I mentioned, right after Muhammad from 632 to 634, and then came Umar for 10 years. Umar was the second caliph. And that was from 634 to 644, according to our calendar. It was a different on the Muslim calendar. AH means after the Hijrah, or after the migration, as the Muslims call it, to Medina, which happened in 622. Then the third caliph was Uthman, 644 to 656. Finally, in 656, Ali became the caliph, and he lasted only 5 years, and things really went haywire after that, because then the Muslim community divided, and Hussein, who took over after his father was murdered, was brutally murdered himself, and so cruel they treated him that in his company of 70 followers, they were denied water for days and days and days before they were finally killed in 680. So Shiites today mourn that, grieve over it, lament over it, and more or less punish themselves. Here's a picture up here of the Shia and Sunni, which is these are the main divisions. About 85% of the Muslim world is Sunni, but you have some Shiites as well. And They are probably 15% of the Muslims. But you do have a couple, two or three countries in the world who are a majority Shia, like Iran, like Iraq, which is a slight majority there, like Bahrain, and the Sunnis have 4 schools of law. In other words, each part of you can go to different parts of the Muslim world and see a different school of law in Sunni Islam. Hanbali in Saudi Arabia, Hanafi in the Indian subcontinent, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and India. But then you have other places too in North Africa and East Africa where they have different Islamic law. As to the Shiites, they also have their own Islamic law, but you do have branches of people who have they have broken away from the Shiites, and here is what we mean by that. Imams from Ali on. Ali, remember, had 2 sons, Hassan and Hussein. So you have the Shiites with 12 imams. There's different kinds of Shiites. You have the 12ers, the 7ers, and the 5ers. By 12ers, we mean 12 imams. Ali the first one, Hassan the second one, Hussein the third, and then on, all the way down. Over the 6th imam, there was a break again. Some said one should be the imam, some said the other, so there was a break. So you have today 7ers. They are the Ismailis. If you go to northern Pakistan, you will see the Ismailis, or Karachi. They're Shiites, but they're really 7ers because they hold to 7 imams. And then the 8th, the 9th, the 10th, the 11th, 12th. The 12th imam went into hiding for fear of being killed, and the Shiites expect him to come back again. The Shiites think of him as the Al-Mahdi, Mahdi meaning Messiah. So let's just finish off by looking at this chart, which is a little bit fuller, showing the genealogy of Muhammad. Already mentioned his grandpa, Abdul Muttalib. One of the reasons why Muhammad was rejected in Mecca was because when he started to preach, he said, there's one God, and so on, and paganism is wrong. And what got him into trouble was that, at least partly, was when he said his grandpa, Abdul Muttalib, was in hell. And you see, to say anything like that against your beloved grandpa, then the people turned against him, and he was basically driven out of Mecca in 622, where he fled for his life, but for the help of his uncle, Abu Talib, he would have been killed. Sometimes I've said to my students that Muhammad and Jesus had some things in common. They were both born in poverty, both had some kind of a spiritual experience at the age 12. Jesus in Jerusalem and Muhammad on his way to Syria, where allegedly a Christian prophet recognized him to be a prophet and looked at a mole on his back and said, this guy is destined to be a prophet. So at the age of 12, supposedly had some kind of an experience, spiritual. And and then another thing that they had in common was that both were rejected in their hometowns. Jesus in Nazareth, I guess you can say, he was rejected all over the place, but rejected in his own hometown, and Muhammad rejected in Mecca. But I think that's about where the similarity ends. Well, I should say that both were offered a kingdom. Jesus was offered a kingdom, and Muhammad was too, and that's where the similarity ends, because Jesus, though he rejected the kingdom, Muhammad went for it, and he fought for it, and he embraced it. And I think that's one of the basic differences, one of the major differences between Islam and Christianity, because Jesus said, my kingdom is not of this world. But Muslims say, our kingdom is of this world, and so they are thinking that they can really, through the right law of God, they can make it a kingdom here. But we know that only Christ can do that. Here are, again, Muhammad and his daughters, his wife, of course, Khadija, and then the daughters, well, not the daughters so much, but his wives, I should say, and so on. This is basically the same. It says down here that capitalized names represent those who played an important role in Muhammad's life or later. Most men shown had more sons than those listed. Muhammad and Muhammad, Ali, and others had more wives than those listed. So it's true. I've only talked about some of the wives of Muhammad, but he had probably 16 wives as far as I can figure out.